I just want to thank the entire Dallas community for giving me this incredible opportunity. The sages teach that words that leave the heart enter the heart, so I'm just going to speak from my heart tonight and tell you about my journey, my Jewish journey, my journey as a writer out in Hollywood and how these two things intersected, and hopefully we'll have a chance to just share together. So I try to remember what was actually my very first memory, conscious memory of God. And I grew up in New York City on the Upper West Side of Manhattan on 79th Street and Broadway. There's a very large building there called the Apthorpe, across the street from Zabar's, if anyone here knows Zabar's. So anyway, we had this giant pink kitchen, and I was 6 years old, and it was nighttime, and I was all alone in the kitchen. And I just learned that when you burp, you're supposed to say, "Excuse me." And there I was in the kitchen at night by myself, and I burped, and I wondered, am I supposed to say, "Excuse me"? There's no one here. And then I thought to myself, well, God's here, and I said, "Excuse me." And that actually is my first memory of God. And after that, I thought some more, and I remembered that there was actually something earlier than that, which was I remember my mother sitting by my bed before I'd go to sleep saying Shema Yisrael with me. And that gets so much into your bones. And it's a famous story, but just in case you're not familiar with it, during World War II, many Jewish children were given shelter in Christian communities. And after the war, rabbis and concerned Jews went to reclaim these children, to bring them back. One of the tragic things was that some of them were taken when they were so young into these non-Jewish environments that they themselves didn't remember that they were Jewish. So how are the rabbis supposed to get and reclaim these precious Jewish souls? And one of the techniques that they would do is they would go into the rooms and they would say, "Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad." And the children who looked up like that, they knew were Jewish, because it gets so much into your bones. By the way, I learned from my Rebbe, my teacher, how to put your children to sleep. Something very beautiful, and I mention it to you for those of you who are parents. And if you have kids, if you don't have kids, you can say it to yourself. You say to your child before they go to sleep, "I love you, and I need you, and Hashem loves you, and Hashem needs you, and you're beautiful." So I grew up in New York City, and I had this crazy goal. I'm not sure how it got into my head, but I wanted to go to Harvard College. And I wasn't a great student, and a very strange thing happened. They let me in. It was actually, believe it or not, I got into my state school and Harvard, and every other school rejected me. Duke University made me an alternate for deferred admission. I'm still trying to figure out what that means. And I'm convinced that any day now I'm going to be accepted. So I got there, and I was at the end of my freshman year, and my classmates were doing all sorts of fancy things, as you could imagine, going to Asia or, interning with Morgan Stanley or some, fancy investment firm or whatever it was, and I didn't have any plans. And I called up my mom and I said, "Well, what am I going to do this summer?" And she said, "Well, I can talk to the superintendent and you can be the elevator man in the building." And I said, "Okay." And she called me back shortly thereafter and said, "You got the job." And it actually turned out to be a turning point in my life in a very, very meaningful way. And I'll tell you why. Because I was actually somewhat embarrassed for Harvard that they had accepted me. And The reason is because I really hadn't done much homework at all in high school. And lest you think my dad went or was a donor, that wasn't the case, which makes this whole thing even more mysterious. But as a sign of penance, I decided that while I was on the elevator, that I would try to read all of the great books that had been written. And so while I was on the elevator, and by the way, you have those very wonderful elevators that require you actually to steer to a floor. That wasn't mine. I just kind of did this and held my book. It's actually, I learned a very important lesson in humility there, because I realized that every day there were people who lived in this very fancy building who had about 30 to 45 seconds of alone time with me every day and failed to take advantage of that opportunity. And so, since it's elevator man etiquette not to read while you have let's say a client, I'd have to wait, and I spent half my time reading and half my time trying to find where I had left off reading. So, but I was reading, I think I started off with 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and I think my second book was Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, and I was really trying to read, like the great books. And something happened while I was reading. I experienced, I would have to put the book down, literally. I would almost like swoon because of the beauty of the sentences. And I realized that I wanted to be a writer. Now I took that job as an elevator man for my sophomore summer and for my junior summer. And then when I graduated, I couldn't fill a page of my resume. I got about a third of a page. It was basically Harvard and elevator man. And I considered at one point, the building was owned by a group called Kenton Associates. And I thought at one point I should change it to Special Intern for Kenton Associates, Researching Problems in Urban Transportation. And then I was just too ashamed to do that. And, when people would ask me, my classmates would ask me what I had done that summer, I remember just sort of looking at them and saying, traveling, So, but I had an awakening of sorts, and I really decided that, with my experience writing for the Lampoon and exploring this creative side that had sort of been awakened by great literature, that I wanted to try writing out in Hollywood. And I had a partner at the time, and we applied for a show, and one of the kind of realities of trying to write for Hollywood is that, you put your heart and soul into producing a script that's polished and that you are very proud of and that you hope is, of a high quality. But getting someone to read it is sometimes harder than the actual writing of the script itself. So it's a real process. It's very difficult basically for everyone. So my partner and I had written for this show. It was one of the early comedies on home box office called Not Necessarily the News. It's going back a time, if anyone knows it. And we had applied, and, it just kind of sat on the producer's desk for a number of months. They didn't look at it. And so I got my job now as a graduate back on the elevator. And if being an undergraduate, elevator man had sort of a rakish appeal to it, being a graduate had none of the charm, even on the rakish level, particularly to my parents. And so one day I got a call that these producers that we had sent this sample material to for their show, for not necessarily the news, liked it and wanted to fly us out, and they offered us a 3-week trial period. So I remember my partner and I, we were supposed to start that Monday, and we took a little tour of the office the Thursday before that Monday just to sort of acclimate ourselves. And I remember we met the various writers there, and when we started on Monday, 2 of the writers were gone. They had been fired, but the Polaroid snapshots of their children were still on the wall of their office. And, you know, it was a very sobering introduction. And I remember an old joke that my father told me when I was growing up about a yeshiva boy who had been thrown out of every single yeshiva in town. They ran out of yeshivas, so they didn't know where to send him. So they decided to send him to the local Catholic school. And when he came home, after the first report card, he had straight A's. And they asked him, well, you know, what happened? And he said, well, I showed up the first day in school, and I had seen that they had nailed one of the boys to the wall. And I realized these people mean business. And so, when I saw that empty office with the snapshots of the kids, I realized, you know, you're either funny or you're out the door. And it's not a joke. And I remember my first week's assignment was, they said, well, you've got a deadline 5 o'clock on Wednesday, and you've got a deadline on Friday as well. The deadline for Wednesday is we're going to be taping, since the show is on a relatively low budget, we're going to be taping little comedy sketch pieces, you know, like minute-long, 30-second-long little pieces in a ice skating rink. And, you know, then they'd shoot them all out and then dole them out in various episodes over the course of the season. So I thought to myself, well, I got to be funny by Wednesday at 5 in a skating rink? And then I realized that's what it means to be a comedy writer. If you have to be in a funny mood to be a comedy writer, then this is not the job for you. It's a craft, and whether your life is falling apart or whether they're asking you to be funny, whatever setting, you have to be able to do that. And it's a very stressful job. It's a very, very, very challenging job. Now, that 3-week trial period, well, we were hoping that it would lead to a big fat contract, but it led to a second 3-week trial period. And then that led to a 4-week contract. And so job security Hollywood style is one of the great, well, it just doesn't exist. So I learned that early. Now, but that job actually worked out well, and then other jobs started happening, and we were going from job to job, and things were actually working out really, really well. And a couple of years into this process, I guess I was 24 at the time, I was really humbled, and I wanted to, everything was going so well. I wanted to find a way to say thank you back to God. And the truth is that this had been, this sense of closeness with God, I mentioned when I was a young boy, just being aware of the presence of God and being brought up in this way. So it was very, very close to me. I remember when I was 15 years old, the small shul across the street from my home, the Karlebach Shul, if anyone is familiar with that. It was Simchas Torah, where we celebrate really the completion of a year of Torah study. And I remember I was holding the Torah and I was dancing with the Torah just as a kid. And I remember feeling like such a sense of peace that this was my life, that this is what I wanted. And yet, I grew up, my background was Reform, and even though it was very proudly Jewish, nonetheless, the explanations and the depth of education and the various mitzvahs were not present in my upbringing. Although I do remember learning something during this period between when I was, say, 15 and 24, and it's something that I'd love to share with you, and I'll ask you to help me out in a moment. You see, one of the amazing things that you learn about Torah is that it encompasses every aspect of your life, all of existence. I'll tell you something very close to me. I once imagined a conversation between two fish. And one fish says to the other, "Do you believe in water?" And the other fish says, "I don't know if I believe in water. My grandfather was very religious. He believed in water." So what's the joke? The joke is there's nothing but water. That's the only thing that's going on. It's the only thing that's going on. And it seems to me that that's a very tangible way of grasping God and the human condition. You see, but why can't the fish in this example see water? Because they're so completely surrounded by it. They're so engulfed by it that they cease to see it. This is what us human beings go through. We're so completely immersed and saturated by godliness that the incredible paradox of the human condition is that we don't see it. And yet that's all there is. God is literally the only thing that's going on. The only thing that's going on. I remember I was having lunch with a friend one time, and I asked him, I said, "Where did you park your car?" He said, "Across the street." I said, "Do you realize you can't walk to your car without swimming through godliness?" It's what it is. People, they think they're being very deep. They wonder, does God exist? A much better question is, ask yourself, do you exist? Because if you exist, for sure God exists. And so, a lot of people ask a big question. They want to know, you go to someone's house for chicken soup, and the next thing you know, you get the bill, and there's 613 mitzvahs. He said, "I just wanted some soup." So the question is, what's with all the Jewish law? What's going on? Were the rabbis control freaks? What's going on? And there's a very simple, beautiful answer to this, which will give you a perspective of how great and how awesome the Torah is. You see, as we said, wherever you go, you're swimming through godliness. Do you know what that means? That means there is no such thing as a secular moment. There's no such thing. And if you want to know why there's so much halacha, why there's so much Jewish law, the answer is because every aspect of every part of your life, wherever you are, has a way where you can elevate and sanctify the mundane. You can uplift whatever it is. So I remember when I was a kid, I found out that there's a Torah way to put on your socks and shoes. I don't know if you all know that. And I'm going to tell you what it is, and I want you to go over it with me. First, you put on your right sock. Then you put on your left sock. Then you put on your right shoe. Then you put on your left shoe. Then, listen carefully, you tie your left shoe. Then you tie your right shoe. All right, now let's go through it again together. Right sock. Left sock. Right shoe. Left shoe. Then you tie your left shoe. Then you tie your right shoe. You know, I wasn't keeping kosher, and I wasn't keeping Shabbos, but I was putting on my shoes and socks every day like a servant of God. You know. So my career was going well. I was just getting started, but it was going well. And I wanted to say thank you to God. And for whatever reason, the way it seemed to me, the best way to say thank you to God, it seemed to me, was to start keeping Shabbos. And I remember thinking at one point, you know, every Friday night when the sun sets, God is saying good Shabbos to humanity. And I thought, well, how can I say good Shabbos back to God? I thought, well, by keeping Shabbos, I can say good Shabbos back to God. And at that point, I was on a show. It was my first half hour, my first sitcom that I was hired to write for with my partner. And it was an early Fox comedy, and I don't imagine that anyone would remember it. It was called Women in Prison. And this was actually before The Simpsons was on Fox. So this is really going back more or less to the birth of the network. And at that point, there were 99 shows in prime time on the air. And my show, this show, was rated 99th. And I remember every once in a while, I'd walk in and I'd ask the assistant there, how do we do this week? And they'd say, 98th. And I just remember thinking, you know, if you're that far down, there's no bragging rights to 98, you know. You might as well be last. So I had been keeping Shabbos at that point for maybe 6 months, and it was easy to do because I was unemployed at the time. So taking Shabbos off wasn't really putting a big dent in the schedule. And from a standpoint of total naivete, I really wasn't trying to be tricky in any way or form. I didn't mention to my employers that I was keeping Shabbos. It just hadn't occurred to me. I had just done it for the first time, so what did I know about these things? So I remember the first Friday night, this was in August, and I lived nearby the studio. The first Friday night, there wasn't much to do, so we got off before sundown, and that was all good. So again, naivete, I couldn't imagine that there was going to be an issue that would ever present itself. The next Friday night, we were sitting in a meeting, and it was in front of this big picture window. And like I said, I lived close to the studio. And it was one of these meetings we've all been in a business setting where it's about to end, and then someone goes, oh, one more thing. And you want to strangle them. And it's just one of these things that, you know, that meeting can go on for who knows how long. It can go on for another hour, you know, who knows? You never know. And I'm watching the sun literally set in front of my face, and at a certain point, I thought to myself, if I don't leave now, I'm not going to make it home in time. And I had never even raised the subject with my bosses, and there were about, I don't know, the writing staff was there and the bosses, so there was maybe, I don't know, about 10 people in the room. And I literally did not know what to do, did not know what to say. And so at one point, I just stood up and I walked out of the room. And in retrospect, I imagine that everyone thought I was going to the bathroom. But I didn't come back. So I was thinking, you know, for a day of rest, I'm getting a lot of agita. And so the next week, that Monday, I said to my partner, you know, I want to keep Shabbos. I want to tell them. And I said to him, listen, I didn't know how it was going to work out exactly. So we walked in, there was a Jewish executive producer and a non-Jewish executive producer, and both very, very fine people. And I remember saying, would it be okay? I would like to ask for permission to take off a few hours early on Friday night so that I can observe the Sabbath. And they looked at me and they said, no. No. It's not okay. And had we known that, we wouldn't have hired you to begin with. And now that we do know that, you're going to have to make a decision, because either you're going to do that or, and they didn't complete the sentence, but there's only one way to complete that sentence, or you're fired. And they said, think about it. And I didn't have to think about it, but they said think about it, so I didn't want to be disrespectful, so I thanked them. And I called my manager, and I told him what had happened. He said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm not going to work. And then he said, if you don't work, then you're never going to work in television again. Now, I don't know if any of you are fans of like old Hollywood movies, but you know how they say, well, you'll never work in this town again? Well, I was like, wow, people actually say this. and someone's saying it to me. It's like, cool, say it again, So, he said, I said, well, I'm not going to work. He says, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'll write movies. He said, well, you don't just write movies. And a lot of people don't realize this, but writing out in Hollywood is very segmented. You've got game shows, one-hour dramas, late night, cartoons. All these things are actually separate industries. Independent things, even though they're all technically writing for Hollywood, they're all separate little mini industries that you have to break into all over again, more or less. So that was his point. The next day I was with my partner, and I had done all my writing with him, all my professional writing. On the Harvard Lampoon, we had written together and sort of discovered together that we wanted to do this professionally. And we had come out together and we had written for, at that point, about 5 years together. Basically, everything I had written was with him. It wasn't Jewish, but an awesome, fantastic person, incredibly supportive, super talented. And I said to him, listen, this is something that you see, it was a very awkward situation that I was in, because we had co-written a script that we were being hired from, so he wouldn't have been hired without me. But at the same time, he was about to be fired because of me, and that didn't seem to be acceptable. And I was not comfortable with that at all. And I remember telling him that there's more to life than chasing a buck, but that if he wanted to try to stay on the show without me, I wouldn't hold it against him. And that if he tried to stay on the show without me and they didn't let him, because we had been hired as a team, that I'd still write with him. And that if he ended up staying on the show without me, if he ever wanted to write again down the line, I'd never hold it against him. And he said to me, I think I would try to stay on the show without you. And because I'd always wonder what would have happened to my career. And so at this point, I was being told that I was going to lose my job, that I was going to lose my writing partner that I had done my entire career of writing with, and that I was never going to work in television again. But I knew very strongly, you could imagine that maybe I was freaking out at this point, and for some reason I wasn't. I was calm. And the reason is because I knew nothing bad was going to come from keeping Shabbos. I knew it. Nothing bad was going to come from keeping Shabbos. It could be that I'd even have to change my career. Maybe I'd have to change my career. I understood that. But nothing bad was going to come from keeping Shabbos. And my agents came in and they talked with the president of the company, and they said, you know something? We want to keep him. And they knocked us down a bump, in terms of title and salary, but we had entered at a slightly inflated salary and title. And we went from that show, which was the bottom show on television, And our next job was on NBC on a top 10 show. And that led to another thing and another thing. And as Stephen mentioned, I went on to The Simpsons, where I won an Emmy Award, and Third Rock from the Sun, where I won a Golden Globe Award. And the reason why I mention those two honors is not to applaud myself, but rather to say the following, which is that the proudest moment of my entire life was the story that I just told you. I have to wrap it up because I have to catch a flight back to Los Angeles. And the truth is that I'd really like to share more. And I give a talk every week. I put it up on the internet. If you look up Spiritual Tools for an Outrageous World, you can hear more talks if you're ever interested on all sorts of things under the sun. But I just want to leave you with one story. I was listening to NPR one time, and they were talking about a great scientific mystery that to this day they still haven't solved. They still haven't solved it. It's the mystery of the monarch butterfly. And every year it goes from Mexico to Canada, and then it flies back from Canada to Mexico. And you might say to yourself, that doesn't sound very miraculous to me. They're migratory patterns, and what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that the monarch butterfly doesn't live for very long, which means that the ones that go from Mexico to Canada don't know that they're supposed to go to Canada and don't know the way to Canada. Not only that, but they really don't live very long, which means that while they're going to Canada, they have children, and then they die, which means the children are born on the road, and they don't even know that they're on the road to Canada. And they have children, and then they die. And now their grandchildren, who for sure don't know anything from Mexico or Canada, or where they're supposed to be going, and yet the fourth generation every year makes it to Canada. And the same cycle repeats itself back to Mexico. And when I heard this, I thought they're talking about the Jewish people. They're talking about all of us. All of us are heading to Israel. That's our destiny. The destiny is that the world is going to reach its state of perfection, where there's going to be no more war, and no more hatred, and no more obstacles to serving Hashem. We're all heading in that direction, and all of us have been born in the middle of that journey. And all of us are discovering what it means to be on the road. You know, Rebbe Nachman of Breslov says that wherever a Jew walks, he's walking to Israel. Even if he's walking in the opposite direction, he's walking to Israel. All of us are going toward the promised land together. And thank God we have a GPS system like data here in Dallas to remind us of our mission, to remind us where we're going. I want to leave you with one last question. Imagine you have a treasure, and the treasure is filled with just piles of gold, piles of diamonds, rubies, Rembrandts, every treasure in the world. And imagine there's a key locking the door to that treasure. And no one can get into that without the key. Let me ask you a question. What's the real treasure? Is it the key or is it the treasure? You see, because if you haven't got the key, you're not getting into the treasure room. Torah is the key. Torah is the key to the treasure of existence. Torah is the key to your soul. Torah is the key to the perfection of the universe. I look forward to celebrating with all of you together in Yerushalayim with the rebuilt Beis HaMikdash and the perfection of the world.